show where we share our favorite stories from Boston history. This is episode 69, Picturing the South End. Hi, I'm Nikki.
And I'm Jake. This week, we're very excited to share our first author interview in nearly a year. We're going to be joined this week by Lauren Prescott, who's the executive director of the South End Historical Society and the author of a new book simply titled Boston's South End. It's part of Arcadia Publishing's Postcard History Series, and it features hundreds of images from the South End Historical Society's collection of historic postcards, dating from the 1860s to the mid-20th century. But before we chat with Lauren, it's time to take a look at this week's featured historic site and upcoming event.
For our featured historic site this week, we're going to send you a little further out of Boston than we usually would, up to Cape Ann, where you can check out Dogtown Common and the Babson Boulders. Dogtown and the Babson Boulders are two different historical attractions, separated by about 250 years, but connected by one man, located in the same spot in the woods along the Gloucester-Rockport town line. We were just there last weekend, and we thought many of you might like it too. When you get parked, check your map and start hiking. You will come to the remains of Dogtown Common first. Dogtown came first historically as well. It was a village that was first just called the Common Settlement. Families began building homes on what had previously been part of Gloucester's common grazing land in the mid-1600s. A schoolmaster named Thomas Riggs built a house there in 1661, and a blacksmith named James Allen had moved in by 1674. In the early days of the colony, this inland location was seen as a safe place to settle because it was out of the reach of pirates who might raid a coastal village or the feared French fleet. By the mid-1700s, the population of Dogtown peaked at about 100 families. During and after the American War for Independence, the population began to wane as men went off to war and never came back, and other families left to seek their fortunes. The War of 1812 put a final nail in the village's coffin. After the British were defeated, there was no longer a threat from the sea. The port of Gloucester was booming, and Dogtown was left behind, with no harbor to engage in fishing or trade, and even bypassed by the new roads that followed the coast to Gloucester. The population fell off dramatically as families went in search of better prospects near Gloucester Harbor or farther afield. As the village became mostly abandoned, rumors circulated about the handful of women who remained in Dogtown. Though many were, in fact, war widows, they were rumored to be witches and prostitutes. By 1815, there were only 6 houses left standing, and by 1830, the last residents had departed. The feral dogs they left behind inspired the name that the area is known by today.
Today, Dogtown is a ghost town. As you follow the former main roads of the village that have now become trails, you'll see small rectangular depressions, some outlined in stone, in the woods near the road. These foundation holes are all that's left of Dogtown. Most foundations are marked by a large stone with a number carved into its face. It's pretty easy to look those numbers up and correlate the house site you're looking at with the family that used to live there. The numbers are the work of Roger Babson. Babson was an eccentric millionaire who had grown up in Gloucester and whose ancestors lived in Dogtown in its heyday. In 1927, Roger and his cousin Gustavus Babson bought 1,150 acres of what was once the Common Settlement, and in 1929, Roger moved into a tiny log cabin not far from where his ancestors had lived. A Boston Sunday Post headline said, "Boston millionaire deserts civilization to live with birds in wilderness of witches and pirates." Roger Babson spent his time mapping and cataloging the old cellar holes he discovered on his property, and correlating them with the families described in his grandfather John J. Babson's 1860 History of Gloucester. When he felt he had conclusively identified a home site, he would hire a mason to carve a number into a large piece of granite to mark the spot. In 1936, he published a tourist guide to Cape Ann, in which he shared a map of Dogtown and the house sites he had mapped out, a lengthy description of each one, and a key to the numbered cellar holes. With the key was a note. Other cellars will be found, but all are not numbered because the owner is not known. An identifying number is cut into a granite boulder near each cellar to help visitors find the cellars and hence follow the trip outlined herein. Those identifying numbers weren't the only thing that Babson hired somebody to carve into the rocks around Dogtown. He hired unemployed stonecutters to carve inspirational sayings into the giant glacial boulders that littered the property. At the time, Dogtown was still open pasture land, so these inscribed stones must have stood out from a distance. Today, a mature forest has grown up around the boulders, so as you're walking through the woods, you might catch a glimpse of a large rock through the foliage and say to yourself, "Is that writing on that boulder? Am I seeing things?"
When you move closer, you'll see 12-inch letters cut into the sheer faces of the boulders, usually traced with black paint to increase the contrast. The inspirational sayings that Roger Babson chose reveal a lot about the mindset of a millionaire who considered himself a self-made man. Never try, never win. Keep out of debt. If work stops, values decay. Prosperity follows service. And, of course, spiritual power.
Spiritual power.
Roger Babson was proud of this work, saying in his autobiography, "Another thing I have been doing, which I hope will be carried on after my death, is the carving of mottos on the boulders at Dogtown. My family says that I am defacing the boulders and disgracing the family with these inscriptions, but the work gives me a lot of satisfaction, fresh air, exercise, and sunshine. I am really trying to write a simple book with words carved in stone instead of on printed paper." His family weren't the only ones who thought Babson's boulders were a bad idea. The painter Marsden Hartley called them an intervention of the worst sort. And after Babson's masons accidentally carved a saying on a boulder on Leila Webster Adams's adjacent land, she went to the press and said, "Just look at that horrible thing. Just look at it. Why, the idea of a man like Roger Babson, so well known and popular, going about carving such things as prosperity follows service, keep out of debt, if work stops, values decay. Whoever heard of such foolish notions?" I think it's safe to say that she wasn't a fan. The boulders weren't Babson's only eccentricity, and they weren't the only stones that he carved inscriptions into. Along with founding Babson College, Roger Babson also started a group called the Gravity Research Foundation. After his sister drowned as a child, Babson regarded gravity as enemy number one and funded research into anti-gravity devices. At over 20 universities around the country, granite slabs remind present and future students about the Foundation's important work. The one at Tufts University in Medford says, "This monument has been erected by the Gravity Research Foundation, Roger W. Babson, founder. It is to remind students of the blessings forthcoming when a semi-insulator is discovered in order to harness gravity as a free power and reduce airplane accidents." A similar slab at Eastern Nazarene in Quincy says that it is to remind students of the blessings forthcoming when science determines what gravity is, how it works, and how it may be controlled. Just a few short years after he bought the land around Dogtown Common, Babson sold it back to the town of Gloucester so that they could construct a reservoir on it. He sold it to them for a pittance, with the condition that the remainder of the land be kept forever open as a public park. Babson's foresight benefits you today if you make the drive to Gloucester and explore the remnants of a 17th century ghost town and a monument to a 20th century millionaire's strange compulsions. We'll post a trail map, Babson's own 1936 tourist guide, and photos from our recent expedition in the show notes this week.
And for our upcoming event this week, we're going to welcome you to our neighborhood, right here in Hyde Park. You may recall that back in episode 23, we featured Sarah and Angelina Grimke.
And since then, we've learned how to pronounce their names.
The Grimke sisters were radical abolitionists and suffragists who made headlines when they led a group of women in Hyde Park in voting in 1870, despite the fact that women did not yet have suffrage. As part of Hyde Park's 150th anniversary celebration, there will be a talk titled The Grimke Sisters in Their Hyde Park Years, Educators, Aunts, and Voters, on Saturday, March 3rd. The presenter will be author and Northwestern University historian Louise W. Knight, who also gave an address about Angelina Grimke's anti-slavery work when Angelina was inducted into the Abolitionist Hall of Fame in 2016. The promotional material says, in Knight's talk, she will capture how the culminating years of the sisters' lives, when they were active as educators, aunts, and voters, marked a fulfillment of the ideas that led them out of Charleston, South Carolina, and out of the Quaker faith, into the abolition and women's rights movements. The event will be held at the Menino Arts Center near Cleary Square in Hyde Park at 2 p.m. on Saturday, March 3rd. We'll have directions and more information in the show notes this week.
We're here with Lauren Prescott, author of Boston's South End and executive director of the South End Historical Society. Hello.
Hi.
So, Lauren, can you just start by telling us a little bit about the South End Historical Society?
Sure. So, in 1966, a group of residents founded the South End Historical Society, and their mission was to preserve the neighborhood. They were mainly interested in the unique architectural quality of the South End, and these residents saw the effects of urban renewal on their neighborhood. In the 1950s, the city of Boston started to investigate the possibility of redeveloping certain neighborhoods that they believed were run down. The first area targeted for redevelopment in the South End was the neighborhood known as the New York Streets. People often say that the demolition of the West End in 1958 was the city's first urban renewal project, but it was actually in the South End in 1955. And today, people know this area as Ink Block. But in the 1950s, it was demolished to be turned into the Boston Herald complex. And the New York Streets neighborhood, of course, was not the only part of the South End to fall victim to urban renewal. So the South End Historical Society filed an application to have the South End listed on the National Register of Historic Places in the early 1970s. The National Register of Historic Places is the U.S. government's official list of district sites, buildings, structures, and objects deemed worthy of preservation. However, even with a National Register listing, protection of property is not guaranteed. But the South End is protected because it was designated a Boston landmark in 1983.
You know, it's funny to hear you mention the West End and the New York Streets neighborhoods in the same breath like that. When we were not that long ago, we went to the West End Museum for the first time, which is a cool, very small museum in the former West End. And obviously a lot of the focus of the museum is on urban renewal and the sort of the effects that has on the city. And they do focus a lot on the New York streets. I don't know that they say explicitly that it's the first neighborhood that experienced urban renewal, but they do definitely mention it. How did urban renewal impact the South End? I know it's been looms very large in the neighborhood's history.
Yes. Well, the first urban renewal project was New York Streets, and then not all urban renewal projects are seen as a negative thing. For instance, Via Victoria was an example of an urban renewal project where the neighborhood worked with the BRA and the city to create something that I would call positive. And that was mainly because originally people who lived in Via Victoria were against this obvious demolition of their neighborhood because they would be displaced. And so what they did is they actually created their own plan for their neighborhood and presented that to the BRA, which surprisingly the BRA accepted and then worked with the community to create something. But yeah, I think that with urban renewal, I think it took away maybe 25% of the South End was demolished until the South End was placed on the National Register.
Can you tell us a little more about what the National Register of Historic Places means for a neighborhood? Because I had never heard of that until I started working in the South End.
Yeah. So
how does that actually create protections?
It's interesting because it doesn't. It's actually kind of symbolic. And so protection of property is not guaranteed even with a National Register listing, which is interesting. The reason why the South End is protected and a lot of other neighborhoods are protected in the city is because they're Boston landmarks. And the Landmark Commission is responsible for protecting the architectural and historical integrity of each neighborhood.
So just to back us up for a second here, we've been talking about the South End, Boston South End. How does the South End Historical Society define the geography of the South End? Because I know it's a little murky.
Well, if you're thinking of the neighborhood geographically, it's bordered by Back Bay, Chinatown, and Roxbury, and is distinguished by other neighborhoods for its Victorian row houses. And the South End is actually the largest Victorian brick row house district in the United States.
So that, I think, gives us a good segue to talk a little bit about the origins of the neighborhood, because originally, Washington Street that cuts through the South End is where Boston Neck was, that little strip of land that connected Roxbury to Boston proper. So how did the South End come to be?
And that's a great question. So until the early 19th century, the South End that we know today was a sort of no man's land between the main part of Boston on the Shawmut Peninsula and the town of Roxbury on the mainland. And during this time, there was a neighborhood known as the South End, and today that's the financial district. And so in 1801, the town selectmen, including Charles Bulfinch, presented a plan to develop some of the necklands between the main part of Boston and Roxbury. This new residential area was originally meant to include freestanding houses surrounded by large gardens and grounds, so it wasn't originally meant to be a row house district. However, this ambitious plan was not successful, and few people purchased land on the neck during this time. After about 10 years, Boston noted that there was no demand for the 50 acres of land, and by 1814, few people purchased only a handful of lots on and around Washington Street. And during this time, of course, the city's population was booming. As the city's population grew, tenement housing began to dominate Boston proper, and the city wanted to keep its tax-paying Yankees from moving to the suburbs and decided to use this newly made land to create a row house district. And so in around 1828, Stephen Fuller developed plans for a row house district that included additional streets and smaller, less expensive lots. With these plans, Boston hoped to attract a wider demographic. And at the same time, and in phases, the city began making land around the neck to increase the available landmass. And major filling of the South End began around 1845 with the initiation of the South Bay Lands Project.
It's funny. I think a lot of people are aware that Boston is mostly built on made land. The Shawmut Peninsula is this very tiny, maybe 450 to 500 acre peninsula, and then we make land all around it. And people are most familiar with the Back Bay as made land, but of course East Boston is made land, the Bulfinch Triangle, most of South Boston. There's made land all around. But the story, as you lay it out, of the creation of the South End sounds very parallel to the creation of the Back Bay about a decade later. In the sort of the late 1850s, there's the same drive thinking, okay, we need to retain the tax base of sort of well-to-do Yankee Bostonians. We want to create a planned neighborhood on made land. So why did the Back Bay arise so quickly after the South End with pretty much the same plan?
It was pretty much the same plan, but also completely different if you think about the design and the style of Back Bay. And if you think about the South End versus the Back Bay, some will say that the South End was kind of a failure because within, a decade of the South End being built up as a new neighborhood, everyone who could afford it was moving to Back Bay. And that was for a few reasons. One, Back Bay had better proximity to downtown Boston and the Public Garden. And secondly, it was seen as more fashionable. So the South End is primarily inspired by English style and design, unlike Back Bay, which is actually based on a French model. So if you think of the Back Bay, you'll notice the wide, straight Parisian style boulevards like Commonwealth Avenue and Beacon Street, and the South End has a much greater intimacy in its street layout. And so the South End's brick row houses, by the time the Back Bay was filled in, was seen as dated. And so a lot of people who could afford it, they moved to this new, more fashionable neighborhood.
So Lauren, to sort of refocus us on the book that you've just written, it's called Boston's South End, but it's part of a postcard-inspired collection of books, and it draws very heavily on the South End Historical Society's postcard collection. I guess, first of all, can you tell us a little bit about how the South End Historical Society came to have such a collection?
Sure. Well, first I'll start with why I wrote the book. This collection itself, these postcards were donated by a man named Jim Roach, who happened to live in Boston. He passed away a few years ago. But also this book has other postcards in our collection, and then also a few that I purchased over the past year, because I'm always trying to add to the Historical Society's collection. But when I became director in 2016, my goal was to highlight our collections at the Historical Society and also make them more accessible to the public. I realized that a lot of our collections were not organized and didn't have finding aids, and they weren't accessible on our website. And so since 2016, I've been working with interns and volunteers to begin making these collections accessible. On our website now, you'll find that we have several finding aids, and we also have a web exhibit, because for most people who have never been inside the Historical Society, we're in a row house on Mass Ave, and we own the whole building, but we only operate on several floors, and it's a pretty small space. And so we're not a typical historical organization or museum, and we have no dedicated space for an exhibit, for a physical exhibit. So I had to kind of get creative since I started working there on how do you highlight a collection. One way is that we recently created a web exhibit based on a collection of letters, our Everett family letters. And these letters were donated by our founding president, Richard Card, who bought them in the 1970s from a woman on Union Park who happened to find them in a shoebox in her attic. And these letters themselves were written between 1851 to 1859 between Otis Blake Everett, who was a young merchant working in India, with his parents Otis and Elizabeth Everett, who lived in the South End. They first lived on Blake's Court and then on Shaman Avenue. And Blake's Court isn't around anymore, but it was very close to where the Cathedral of the Holy Cross is today. And these letters, we use these letters to create the web exhibit, which really give you a snapshot into the lives of a family in the neighborhood in the mid-19th century. But the exhibit also explores love, marriage, sickness, and death in Victorian Boston. And then another way you could highlight a collection, particularly some images, is through a book. And that's why I wrote Boston South End. But the book wasn't my idea. It was Arcadia that floated the idea to me a few years ago.
So can you tell us a little bit about what the golden age of postcards is? Because I found this to be really interesting. I have a few antique postcards of my own that I've picked up along the way, and I didn't realize how much of a thing it was.
Yeah. So up until around 1898, the U.S. Post Office was the only institution allowed to print postcards until Congress passed the Mailing Card Act in 1898. And then between 1898 to 1915, a postcard craze known as the Golden Age of Postcards captivated the world. To give you an example, in 1905 alone, people mailed over 7 billion postcards worldwide, and this does not include those purchased for personal collections. And the popularity of postcards encouraged more businesses, especially local family-run businesses, to get involved. So a lot of the postcards that you'll see in my book are small family-run businesses, which are some of my favorite postcards.
So what is your favorite postcard in the book?
My favorite one is the one of Frank Jane's Pharmacy, which was located on the corner of Mass Ave and Columbus. And it's a
great location.
Yes. This photo shows a bustling corner with early automobiles and people hanging around outside. And today, this location is now my local Dunkin', where I happen to grab coffee every morning before going into the office. And this was an example of one of our postcards that we didn't already have in our collections, but I happened to find while doing some research for the book.
And just for some insider information for our listeners, my office is above that Dunkin' Donuts. So I spend time on that corner every day.
It's a great corner.
So here's another question that I'm curious about to hear from you. If you could bring back a South End landmark that no longer exists, what would you bring back? Just one. What would it be?
That's a great question. I will probably change my answer multiple times depending on what time of the year people ask this question, but now I'll say Castle Square Theater. The Castle Square Theater was located where the Animal Rescue League of Boston is today, near the junction of Tremont, Arlington, and Herald Streets. It was a huge Rococo-style building that was built around the Bunker Hill cyclorama, not to be confused with the Gettysburg cyclorama, which is still around today and part of the Boston Center for the Arts. And this theater was large. It was so large that it had its own stock company and performance troupe, and you could catch a show every night of the week. And I just really wish that it was still around so I could catch a show.
Now, what happened to it?
Basically, the Great Depression hit, and there was no longer any interest in shows, and so they demolished the building. A lot of buildings were actually demolished in the South End around the 1930s.
So it's interesting. This isn't one of the ones that was lost to fires. This is one that just,
yes,
preservationists didn't get to in time, basically.
Yes.
So you mentioned the cyclorama briefly, which is part of the Boston Center for the Arts campus today, and perhaps some of our listeners have been to events at the cyclorama. What was the original purpose of that building?
Sure. Well, cycloramas were a popular form of entertainment during the late 19th century, and most major cities in both Europe and North America had at least one. And they were built to house enormous panoramic murals, and these murals frequently depicted battle scenes which evoked a sense of national pride while presenting graphic depictions of many historical events. And the one where the Boston Center for the Arts is today used to be the Battle of Gettysburg, the Gettysburg cyclorama. And this one opened in 1884. And the original painting, of course, the Battle of Gettysburg, was a turning point in the Civil War when the Union defeated the Confederacy and established the North's dominance in the war. The cyclorama, of course, was never built for actual battle, but the facade was interesting because it had a fortress-like display of towers and battlements, and that was to instill a war-ready feeling to those entering the building. Today, none of the towers or battlements remain, but if you go inside the Boston Center for the Arts today, you can see the impressive domed skylight.
You know what else you can see in there today? An award-winning bathroom.
What?
You gotta go in the men's room if you're in the cyclorama. Mm-hmm. Now, I personally have been in the men's room specifically to see the award-winning architecture of the bathroom. So, fun tip right there.
That is very interesting. I will make a mental note and definitely go in the bathroom next time I'm in there.
I've been to the cyclorama. I've been to events there, and until I saw the postcard in your book, I had no idea about the original facade and the sort of crenellated castle-like towers that were out front at the time.
It looks like a Disney attraction. When I saw the postcard, that's what it brought to mind.
A few years ago, Nikki and I visited the Gettysburg battlefield for the first time since we were kids, and we saw in the visitor center there, not the entire cyclorama painting, but much of it is on display, complete with cannons and mannequins and fake turf in the foreground that I think is consistent with how it would have been displayed in Boston originally. It gives it a very sort of original virtual reality sense that it's very immersive.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that they still did that today at Gettysburg, but I do know they did that at the cyclorama in the 19th century, where you would climb an underground stairway and end up in the middle of the battlefield, basically. And railings would keep viewers from getting too close, and objects such as artillery, terrain, and even replicas of soldiers were placed between the painting and the viewer to try and blur the distinction between art and reality. So I actually really like that they still do that today at Gettysburg.
Yeah, I thought it was very effective. It's not, you don't go through an underground stairwell or an underground corridor, but you come up into I think a second or third floor large room where it's displayed, and you come up the stairs into the middle with railings to keep you contained, and then stuff in the foreground to simulate the battlefield. It sounds very similar.
Yeah. So some other things that popped up in the book, buildings that I'm interested in the South End. Another was the Piano Factory building, which is on Tremont Street, just outbound of Mass Ave. What can you tell us about the Piano Factory?
That is actually a really great building, and it's right around the corner from the Historical Society. It belonged to Chickering & Sons, and Chickering & Sons was an American piano manufacturer in Boston, and it was one of the earliest. A man named Jonas Chickering founded the company in 1823 with James Stewart, who was also a piano maker. And by 1827, Chickering worked independently to transform his company into a global industry. And by the mid-19th century, Chickering & Sons was the largest piano manufacturer in the United States. Now, originally, their headquarters were located on Washington Street in downtown Boston, and it was a 5-story building built in 1837. It had a huge, large wareroom and small performance hall, but there was a really devastating fire in 1852, which destroyed the factory. And so when they were looking for a new factory location, they chose the South End, right on Tremont Street. But unfortunately, Chickering actually never saw his new factory because he died of a stroke months before its completion in December 1853.
So the Chickering factory was just one in a series of factories that were really the sort of a center of piano and organ manufacture in the U.S., right?
Yes, so Boston was really a hub for piano manufacturing in the late 19th century. To give you an idea, basically between 1870 and 1930, a big ticket item in every household was to have a piano. And if you didn't have a piano, you aspired to have a piano. And Boston was able to take advantage of this demand. In the 19th century, Boston's population was thriving. For example, in 1800, Boston's population was about 25,000, but by 1880, that number soared to almost 364,000. And many of the immigrants were highly skilled craftsmen and carpenters. And these highly skilled craftsmen built up the piano industry in Boston. Now, most of the factories were located in the South End, mainly because the South End had the space to build them, and the sales rooms were usually located in downtown Boston.
So not too long ago, I came across a really great summary of the history of the piano factory building and also some of the uniqueness of the architecture, like the sloping floors and whatnot. And we'll include a link to that in the show notes so some folks can check it out because it's really pretty cool.
Well, speaking of music in the South End, this has nothing to do with pianos, but more to do with rock and roll in the 20th century. I want to start with, I had no idea until I looked at your book that the eventual rock venue called the Boston Tea Party started out as something called the Theodore Parker Memorial Hall. Can you tell our listeners who Theodore Parker was and then what the hall named after him was used for?
Sure. Theodore Parker was a Unitarian minister and abolitionist, and the hall was built in 1872 right on the corner of Berkeley and Appleton Streets for the 28th Congressional Society and the Parker Fraternity. What's interesting is that the facade of the building has a Star of David window, but this building was originally built as a Unitarian meeting house. And then in the later 19th century, it served the Jewish community as Adath Israel's religious school. And then after World War I, the building no longer served the church or social groups. And I'm not sure if it was vacant for any amount of time, but briefly, between 1967 to 71, the building was home to the Boston Tea Party concert venue, which really attracted famous artists and bands such as Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, The Grateful Dead, Fleetwood Mac, and The Who. And then, I'm not sure if it was vacant again, but I do know today that it is a 7-Eleven.
And if I can just tease next week's episode for our listeners, we're going to be speaking with author Ryan Walsh about his upcoming book about the year 1968 in Boston, which has a lot of asides about the Boston Tea Party and the various acts who were playing there in the era he covers. So tune in next week for that.
So, Lauren, another building that I wanted to ask you about is one of the homes on Columbus near Greenwich Park that has a really cool lion statue out front. And I have heard multiple times the rumor that the house was owned by P.T. Barnum. Can you confirm or deny?
Great question. I will deny. So I'm not sure when that rumor started, but P.T. Barnum never lived at 511 Columbus Avenue. It turns out that lion was sculpted for a man named Dr. Orrin Strong Sanders. He was a prominent homeopathic physician in Boston, and he had the lion placed there when he built the home in 1872. And the building itself was designed by a well-known architect named Thomas Siloway, and he's also responsible for designing the Evangelical Lutheran Zion Church, and we know that building today as the Jorge Hernandez Cultural Center. And Dr. Sanders also served on the Boston School Committee and helped found the New England Home for Little Wanderers, and he lived in the home until he died in 1898.
Well, that's really not as interesting as P.T. Barnum.
It really isn't, probably.
But
and the rumor hasn't died.
no. Sometimes history is more interesting than the rumor. Sometimes it's less interesting than the rumor. So this will be one of those less times.
So as long as we're talking about some of our favorite landmarks in the South End, our listeners may remember way back in episode 20, we talked about John Hancock and his role in the early history of Boston's Corps of Cadets, sort of a private military corps. Now, the Corps of Cadets Armory is in the South End. Can you tell us a little bit about the Cadet Armory and what it was built for?
Sure. The armory was located at the corner of Columbus Avenue and Arlington Street, and it was originally built for the First Corps Cadets. And during this time, there were profound changes taking place in the city. The population increased by about 25% each decade, and the influx of immigrants were perceived as threatening to many established Americans. In addition, many of these immigrants worked long hours under pretty deplorable conditions for low wages, which potentially created a tense situation. And Boston soon became the hub for labor organizations seeking to improve working conditions of Americans. And parades and strikes for better living and working conditions made disorder seem inevitable. And this armory in the middle of the city was built not only as a symbol of strength, but also as an actual defense against civil disturbances and riots, which of course never happened.
Now, the armory was built with what I consider a pretty iconic tower. It's very visible, very prominent. But I understand that the tower wasn't necessarily meant just as a landmark, but as a way to watch out for civil disturbances and even to be able to signal the State House in case of a riot. Have you heard the same thing?
I have heard the same thing, yes. And I'm sure it was, but I don't. Actually, a lot of the armories in the U.S., because armories were pretty popular during this time, they were built up around the U.S., I don't think there were ever any civil disturbances or riots where these armories were actually useful.
So it's funny that you mentioned that armories like that were common sights at cities at the time. I didn't know until reading your book that the Corps of Cadets Armory wasn't the only armory in the South End. Can you tell us about the other guard armory that used to be on East Newton?
Yes, so there was actually one located on East Newton Street in the neighborhood. It was designed by architects Gridley F. Bryant and John Eaton, and Gridley F. Bryant was a renowned architect, and he's also responsible for designing Boston City Hospital, the Massachusetts State House, and the Old City Hall on School Street. And this particular armory was built in 1889 for the Massachusetts Volunteer Militia for the National Guard. And as I said before, in the 19th century, armories were popular in the United States when the National Guard served as the nation's peacekeeper and defense against civil unrest. The city itself demolished the armory in 1963, and I'm not sure why they demolished it, but they did. And then the Solomon Carter Fuller Mental Health Center is there today, which opened in 1976.
So, speaking of other towers, the other well-known tower in the South End is Pine Street Inn. And I learned that building wasn't built to provide homeless services, that there's a use that predates the current. So can you tell us a little bit about, why that building was built and why it has that really iconic tower?
Yes, that building is actually one of my favorites in the neighborhood. It was originally the Bristol Street Fire Station, which was the former headquarters of the Boston Fire Department, and it was built after the Great Boston Fire of 1872. That particular fire was the city's largest urban fire and took 2 days to control, ultimately destroying 776 buildings. Incredibly, there were only 13 casualties. And to prevent another disastrous fire, Boston built a new firehouse with an observation tower. Noted architect Edmund Wheelwright, who is also responsible for Horticultural Hall and the Longfellow Bridge, designed the fire station, and it was built between 1892 and 1894, and Wheelwright modeled the Renaissance Italian-style tower after the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, Italy, and Florentine towers became a popular design for fire stations in the U.S. during this time. Now, in 1961, headquarters for the Boston Fire Department moved to Roxbury, and this building remained vacant until 1980 when the Pine Street Inn moved in. And today, this unique building is still the location of the Pine Street Inn, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is a nonprofit organization that provides meals, shelter, and services to the city's homeless. And just a little bit of information about the Pine Street Inn. They were originally established in 1969 on Pine Street in Chinatown, and at first they offered shelter and coffee for about 200 men. And in the 1980s, they outgrew their original facility and moved to the former Boston Fire Department headquarters. And today they provide shelter, outreach, and job training to about 1,600 men and women per day. And their goal is to make permanent housing a possibility for all people.
I also wonder whether the architect Edmund Wheelwright, who designed that building, was cribbing from the same sources as the architects who designed the Pilgrim Monument out in P-Town, because if you look just sort of from the shoulders up at both towers, they're almost identical.
That is very interesting. It is exactly the Pine Street Inn tower.
Yeah, isn't that neat? I always, there must be a story there. I just am too lazy to go and research it.
So way back in episode 11, we covered the Ursuline Convent riots in Charlestown. Can you tell us a little bit about the significance of the Cathedral of the Holy Cross, given that the city has a long history of anti-Catholic sentiment?
Sure. So by the time the Cathedral of the Holy Cross was built in 1875, anti-Catholic sentiment had really died down in Boston. Many Irish immigrants fought for the Union during the Civil War, and this showed native-born Americans that Irish immigrants were loyal to the U.S. I will say that the Cathedral of the Holy Cross is important for several reasons. One, it showed that Catholicism had become part of the culture. This was no longer a solely Protestant city. But secondly, I think this church was built to remember what Catholics had endured in Boston in the past. For example, the arch in the vestibule was built with bricks saved from the Ursuline Convent in Charlestown. The Ursuline Convent was part of an anti-Catholic riot in 1834, where a group of Protestants burned the convent to the ground. The convent was operated as a school for girls and was run by Ursuline Catholic nuns. It's interesting because the school's purpose was not to teach Catholicism, and it was open to all denominations. Apparently, before the riot, a woman named Rebecca Reed claimed to be an escaped nun from the Ursuline convent, and her stories of being abused were published in a book. This book is considered today to be highly fictionalized and used as a piece of anti-Catholic propaganda. However, many Bostonians who read it at the time were angered, and it eventually led to the riot that burned the convent down. Thankfully, no one was harmed in the riot. But it is remembered today, although I'm sure a lot of people don't actually know that the bricks in the vestibule were used from the Ursuline convent.
I did not know that.
Lauren, we talked about the building that you would bring back if you could. What's your favorite building in the South End today that's still standing, and what's the historical significance of that building?
My favorite building today is definitely the Franklin Square House on East Newton Street across from Franklin Square. It's an elegant 7-story building built in the French Second Empire style, and it looks very similar to the old City Hall on School Street. But not only is it a beautiful building, it also has an interesting history. It was originally built as the St. James Hotel in 1867. With over 400 rooms, it was the largest in Boston, yet it was only a hotel for a brief period of time. Between 1882 and 1901, the building was home to the New England Conservatory of Music, which is the oldest independent school of music in the U.S. The school had rooms for around 550 students and included a concert hall which sat 2,500 people. And eventually the school built a bigger facility on Huntington Avenue, which is still there today. And then it became the Franklin Square House, which was a working girls' home. And for anyone who knows the show St. Elsewhere, the building was used as an external backdrop for that show.
Oh, I did not know that.
So when you say it was used as a working girl's house, what?
That's not what we mean when we say working girl today.
What did that mean at the time?
Sure. So when we think of the South End, we know that it changed from a relatively wealthy neighborhood to a vibrant working class community in the late 19th century, and single family homes were being transformed into boarding houses and lodging houses, but there were other types of accommodation in the city as well. There were apartment hotels, which were sort of like short-term apartments but had all the amenities of a hotel. Many families who lived in the city for a few months out of the year would live here. Some happened to be quite elegant, while others were more modest. And then you also had something called working girls' homes, which popped up at the turn of the 20th century. These were mostly run by religious organizations, and they were meant to provide young single working women or students with safe and affordable housing in the city. And at the turn of the 20th century, most women in Boston were working around 60 hours a week for around $1 per day, and average housing in the city at the time was about $5 per week, leaving single women unable to afford decent housing. And these working girls' homes were more than lodging, so I wouldn't consider them boarding houses. They had libraries, dining rooms, auditoriums for performances, parlors to entertain guests, and reading rooms. And the Franklin Square House happened to be a working girls' home. Another one in the South End that many may know is St. Helena's House, which is on Union Park Street. And both of these homes today are now elderly housing because working girls' homes weren't really needed after World War II. After World War II, it was really common for women to enter the workforce, and women really benefited from better working conditions after the war.
So if working girls' homes were really focused on young single women who were working in the city, what was an apartment hotel? I've read a good bit about boarding houses and rooming houses in the South End, but the whole concept of an apartment hotel was new to me when I read your book.
Yes, so apartment hotels were just sort of like short-term apartments where families who lived in the city for a few months out of the year would stay, and they had all the amenities of a regular hotel.
So it's like the Residence Inn of the turn of the 20th century.
And this is different than a boarding house, which is still a separate thing. Is that true?
Yes. So if you think of an apartment hotel, they looked like apartments, regular apartments. They weren't just a room that you could rent. So a boarding house or a lodging house could be a single room in a row house, in someone's house that someone owned, where you would share a common kitchen or a bathroom.
Gotcha. Now, going back to the very beginning of our conversation, we talked a little bit about the relationship between the South End and the Back Bay and kind of the exodus to the Back Bay. The South End wasn't the lowest income neighborhood in the city, but certainly there were a lot of residents that did have needs. Can you just talk a little bit about the services that popped up in the community that folks could turn to for help?
Sure. So as we saw this shift in the neighborhood, many institutions stepped up to assist the neighborhood's neediest residents. Most happened to be religious institutions. In addition, several churches during this time became known as institutional churches. And these churches needed to provide more than just Sunday sermons to the community. They needed to help those in need through programs and social services. And the most notable, perhaps, is Morgan Memorial, which everyone knows today as Goodwill. But it was founded by a man named Henry Morgan. He founded Morgan Chapel in 1861 after arriving in Boston a few years prior. But it wasn't until after he died that the church thrived under a man named Edgar James Helms and evolved into Morgan Memorial Goodwill Industries. Edgar James Helms was a graduate of Boston University, and he took over Morgan Memorial in 1895 and was really appalled by the conditions faced by many residents, many of whom were unemployed immigrants. And so Helms offered a self-supporting method of relief for residents rather than just charity, and it began with Morgan Memorial's relief bags, which the church distributed throughout the richer districts in Boston, asking families to donate any clothing or other items they no longer wanted. And workers brought these items back to Morgan Memorial, where they would clean, repair, and resell items in the department store on the ground floor. And Morgan Memorial really thrived under Helms and evolved into Morgan Memorial Goodwill Industries. And the church was unique in that it was more than a church. It was also a social center, a rescue mission, an industrial facility, and a children's settlement.
So, Lauren, are there any upcoming events at the Historical Society that people should know about?
Not particularly at the Historical Society, but I do have several book talks coming up. One is February 27th at the South End Library, and another is at the Gibson House Museum on March 20th.
We are big fans of the Gibson House Museum.
I really love the Gibson House Museum.
And how can people follow you and the Historical Society on social media?
Sure, they can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we also, on our website, have an events calendar where anyone can see any of the events that we have. And so not all of our events for members, many of them, especially our walking tours, are for anyone.
And we'll include links to all of those accounts in the show notes for this week's episode. So, Lauren, thank you for joining us today. It was really great to hear about your book, and I appreciate, as somebody who has worked in the South End for a while, all of the, trivia on the buildings and things like that came up. One thing I will plug, if anyone's interest is piqued after this episode, is the Boston Women's Heritage Trail, which does have a tour that you can self-guide all through the South End, and you would then see a lot of the things that we talked about today.
And thank you for having me on the podcast. It was my very first.
To learn more about the South End and Lauren Prescott's new book, check out this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/069. We'll have a link to buy the book, as well as information about the South End Historical Society. We'll also have more information about the famous piano factory in the South End, historic photos of the South End, and photos from the Gettysburg Cyclorama, as well as information about the Boston Women's Heritage Trail. And of course, we'll have links to information about this week's featured historic site and upcoming event.
A listener named Bob recently caught up on episode 55 about Jesse Pomeroy, Boston's youngest serial killer. He took to Twitter to warn his followers, "Do not listen to this episode unless you're ready to be shocked, creeped out, and saddened all at once." He's not wrong.
A listener named Alex also got in touch with us saying, "I recently discovered your podcast and it has become one of my favorites by which to run in the morning. I was born in Dorchester and hearing interesting stories of my favorite city makes me happy and motivated. I'll keep running. You keep podcasting." Sounds like a great plan, Alex. Keep running and keep your ears peeled for a future episode about the history of the Boston Marathon.
If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at podcast@hubhistory.com. We're Hub History on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Or you can go to hubhistory.com and click on the Contact Us link. While you're on the site, hit the subscribe link and be sure that you never miss an episode. If you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, please think about writing us a brief review. It's still the best way to help others discover the show.
That's all for now. We'll be back next time to talk to author Ryan Walsh about his new book, Astral Weeks, A Secret History of 1968.